Hi, I'm Sejal Lannerman from URI Cooperative Extension, and today we are in Warren, Rhode Island, visiting Hope in Maine, an incubator kitchen where food makers from all over the state come and make commercial products. Today, I'm really excited to teach you how to make a low-sugar strawberry jam using the water bath canning method so that we can create a product that can live in our pantry until we open it up, and then of course it goes into the refrigerator. Before we start cooking though, let's go visit a farm here local in Rhode Island. We're gonna pick some strawberries, we're gonna ask some questions, and then we'll head back here and get cooking. It's June, and that means strawberries are in season. Today we are visiting Quonset View Farm, a farm located in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, where we are going to meet the grower. We're gonna get some quick tips, and we're gonna get out there and pick these delicious strawberries and then bring them into the kitchen where we're gonna show you how to safely make a low sugar jam. Michael, thank you so much for having us out here on your farm. I know it has a long history, so you gotta tell us, when did it all start?
Well, thanks for coming. It started in 1902. I'm the 5th generation that's been on this farm. My grandparents are the ones who run the day-to-day operations, but I've been here pretty much since 2009. So we're a GAP certified farm, and that just has a basic guidelines of food safety and consumer safety for the product. We also have the responsibility of the consumer themselves, because it's, like you said, it's like a shared responsibility between all of us. And everyone wants safe food.
Yeah, right? So it starts here on farm, and I'm really excited that you guys are in that program, but then we need to carry that as we go into our kitchen and as we're cooking things. So that's awesome. Thank you so much for having us out here. I hope you don't mind, but we're gonna grab some containers.
Oh yeah, help yourself.
I'm gonna get out there
and
start picking.
You won't move too far.
So we talked about how food safety is a shared responsibility between the grower and between the consumer. So I just want to give a couple of quick tips on what you can do when you're out here picking on a farm or in your own backyard. So first, and I've already done this, you want to make sure that you're washing your hands before you come out to your garden, before you visit a farm. A lot of people remember to wash their hands when they're done, but they forget to wash their hands when they go to pick. So that's my first tip that I have for you. Another one is picking into, when you're at a farm, single-use containers, or at home, I love to use like a kitchen colander, because when you're done, you can simply put it into the dishwasher and it will clean it. So we're gonna pick into these nice containers. Another tip that I have is avoid strawberries or any fruits or vegetables that you're picking that have any open wounds or bruises, are really touching the ground. And that's really gonna help kind of keep some of those foodborne pathogens out of the equation. All right, looks like we have the perfect amount of juicy, delicious strawberries. So let's head into the kitchen and make some jam. That was so much fun picking those strawberries, and we got so many. Before we dive right in and make our jam, I want to introduce you to my friend and colleague, my partner in crime from URI Food Safety Education Program, Nicole Richard. One of the frequently asked questions we get all the time is, can I make up my own recipe? Can I use a recipe that's in my family's history for a really long time? What would you say to that?
Yes, that's a great question. We recommend using research-tested recipes, which means someone has measured the thermal process while they're canning, and they know that the slowest heating part in that jar reaches the right temperature for an appropriate time. So therefore you have a safe, shelf-stable product after you process it. With jams and jellies, they're acidic, so the biggest concern is the growth of mold, but you still want to follow a research-tested recipe so that you have a really good, safe, high-quality product after.
So when we go to use some of our equipment, we want to also make sure that we're using equipment that is safe for canning. And people come to our class all the time, they're like, can I use this jar? And it has one of those latch lids, or can we use the wax? You know, some of those older methods of preserving. Can we still do those?
No, you really want to use the mason jar with the 2-piece lid, because all the recipes have been tested using these type of jars. So we have our 2-piece lid and a mason jar, and this is just the 1/2 pint. There's plenty of different sizes, and you want to make sure that when you follow a recipe, you use the size jars that are recommended of the recipe. So the jars with the bales are not appropriate because you don't know if you have a good seal. And the wax on top is not safe because you haven't thermally processed your product, so you might get mold growth pretty quickly. But that's just talking about the jams and jellies. There's so much we could talk about if we want to talk about acidified foods, low acid foods.
Right.
It goes on and on.
It does go on and on. And I think one of the things we always are thinking about are botulism. So that is why we want to make sure that we are using those research tested recipes. Not usually the case with jams and jellies, but of course, if you want to get into pickling cucumbers and making salsas, that's where we really, really just need to pay equal attention to making sure we're finding those really, really good recipes.
Yes.
I can't promise I won't have more questions for you along the way, but I think you've given me enough information. I'm going to get started. I'm going to make this low sugar strawberry jam, and I'm really excited.
Great.
All right, we'll see you in a little bit. All right, so we are following a low sugar strawberry jam recipe that comes from the Ball Blue Book. So it has been tested and approved. One of the first things that we need to do is wash our hands, which I've already done, and we need to wash our produce. This particular recipe is going to yield 6 to 7 half-pint jars, and it calls for 5 cups crushed strawberries, and that's about 3 quarts. It's going to be give or take, right? Because some strawberries are going to be bigger, some are going to be smaller. So sometimes it's good to buy just a little extra because we want to make sure that we get to the 5 cups crushed. So what I'm going to do starting out with is just simply start chopping my strawberries. I don't have a fancy little thing that cuts out the hull, but you might have one at home, but I use a knife and I just try to get it as sharp as I can right to where the green part is. I'm gonna save the tops for my compost pile. Another thing that you want to think about is if you come across a strawberry, even though I've washed them, I haven't closely examined every single one. So as you are going through these, if you find one that is kind of nasty, it's moldy, or it's just got a big bruised opening, gaping hole, that is something you're not going to want to put into your jam recipe. Perfectly fine for the compost pile, but one of the things we always say in the food safety world is garbage in, garbage out. Meaning if you tried to take a piece of produce that was already deteriorating, we wouldn't be able to make it better by preserving it. So we always want to make sure that we are starting with high quality fruits and vegetables. All right, so after I removed a couple tops, a little quick tip here, just get them as small as you can. You don't have to worry about it because we're going to be mashing them in here, but it definitely gets a little bit easier to mash if we kind of take the time to chop these up a little bit. And it does become a little bit easier to work with a little bit at a time, because if you try to put a whole bunch of chopped strawberries in there and mash all at once, it kind of takes forever. So I'll show you what I mean here in just a second. So we're gonna take these, I've got a bowl here and just your simple masher. Set that off to the side for a minute. Put these in here. And then I'm gonna take your masher. These come in all different shapes and sizes. And hey, this is fun for kids if you got kids in your family or another partner in crime that you might have. And you're just gonna slowly just get in there and mash, mash, mash. We're making a jam, so there are going to be bits and pieces in our final product. But you do want to get them crushed to the best of your ability. All right, so we're gonna bring this here to the center. All right, so we are ready to get closer to canning. So you can tell what's in front of me, this big pot of boiling water. Chances are you have a pot like this at home. A lot of Rhode Islanders cook lobster and they cook a lot of corn. So there's nothing fancy about a water bath canner other than it's pretty large. And if you'll know it's suitable for your use if when you load your jars in that the water is covering it by at least 2 to 3 inches. So we'll talk about that again in a minute. But the first thing I'm going to do is talk about what's in my hand. So this is called a rack. So even if you have a big stock pot at home, you're still going to need a rack or some sort of hot pot to go down at the bottom. So that's the first thing I'm going to do right now is open this up. We just have some hot water getting ready to boil, and that's going to load in there, and that's going to make sure that when we go to load our jars in, they're not directly touching the bottom, but it's also going to allow for that hot water to move in and out between those jars. So the next thing I'm going to do before we start prepping our strawberries even more is we're going to take our canning jars. These are half-pint jars, and I'm using half-pint jars because that is what my approved recipe calls for. And I'm going to very carefully load them in. They've already been washed with hot soap and water, And the reason why we're gonna load them in empty is because we need them to be really, really hot when we go to load in that hot strawberry jam. Because if we didn't, there's a good chance they would break. And hopefully I'm not gonna break any while loading them in here. Okay, so we're gonna let those just sit and get really nice and hot while we tend to our strawberries for a little bit. So over here, remember, just our crushed strawberries, and what we are going to add to it is some water. So we have five cups of strawberries. We're gonna post the recipe, so don't worry about that too much. And we have 1 cup of water that we're gonna add to this. And then the other thing that we are going to add is something called pectin. If you've never heard of pectin before, it is something that comes from plants, and it is basically a fiber. If we did not add pectin to our strawberries right now, we would basically be making a syrup. But it's the pectin that allows for that jam to firm up and get nice and firm and become a jam or a jelly. So I'm just simply mixing that in until it dissolves. Now the pectin that I am using today, because there are many different pectins on the market, is called a low sugar pectin. And why low sugar pectins are really nice is if you would like to make a jam that is a lot lower in sugar. A lot of times typical jams, if you're not using that low sugar pectin, can use upwards of a cup in 1 jar of jam. But by using a low sugar pectin, we're able to decide in this recipe up to 3 cups. So we could be using 3 cups of sugar, but I tasted these strawberries and they're already really nice and sweet. So we're gonna go with just about a cup. You'll wanna follow the directions on the pectin. They'll let you know if you can use other types of sweeteners like honey or maple syrup. And the other thing that you should know, although it is really terrific that we've reduced the amount of sugar, when you go to open up your jam and put it in the refrigerator, keep an eye on it. If you don't eat it quick enough, there is the chance that mold could grow, and if that's the case, you will unfortunately want to toss it out. And that's because sometimes when we add a lot of sugar, that sugar binds to the water and reduces the chances of mold growing. But since we're not adding a lot of sugar, a little mold might grow, and if that's the case, then we just want to toss it. Just make sure you're consuming it all up. So we're just gonna stir this, and we are gonna wait for it to come to a boil. All right, so now that it boiled hard for 1 minute, I'm going to turn off the heat on that burner. And I'm going to very carefully take it over and get it ready to load into those jars. Smells delicious. All right. Now we're gonna carefully remove the lid and get those hot jars out of there. It's gonna get a little steamy in here. And we're gonna just grab all of the jars very carefully. Okay. All right, and we're gonna put the lid right back on there and bring it back to a boil. This is probably the last time that we'll use this one, so I will set it aside. So now what we are going to do is we are going to very carefully ladle the hot strawberries into the really, really hot jars. You can use something like this to help touch those hot jars. You can also use this to wrap around it. Okay, so I'm gonna use this little clamp right here, and I'm gonna grab it, and I'm gonna very carefully take these strawberries and I'm gonna load it in. So with the recipe that I'm using, it calls for a 1/4 inch headspace. And what that means is we need to leave a little bit of space between the jam and the top of the jar. So just where a little bit of air is going to be. And all recipes will tell you how much headspace to leave. And jams and jellies are typically a 1/4 inch. So I'm gonna do the best that I can right now, and I will take a little bit of a closer look in a little bit after I do all of these jars. And now what we're going to do is I'm using a wooden spoon, again, not using metal, so I'm not imparting that metallic taste. And I'm just gonna go through and I'm just gonna adjust and move around and shift the ingredients to make sure that there's not any air bubbles in there. You wanna bring them all to the surface so it doesn't affect that headspace. Okay, and inevitably, there's some product that kind of spills onto the jar. So what you want to do is you want to take a nice clean paper towel, and you're just going to make sure that you get off any little bit of substance just might be on the top of those jars. We are going to take those lids that we had before, and we're just going to go through, and we are going to place them in each one of the jars. And then for the next part, right, so we're going to form a vacuum seal, but to make sure that these kind of stay in place when they're in the canner, that's what we're going to use the rings for. And the rings just go on, and they don't go really, really tight, they just go finger tight. And that's just to hold those lids in place while they're going through the canner, and to make sure that that vacuum seal is ready to go. Carefully open up the lid. Again, it's gonna get nice and steamy. It's starting to smell absolutely delicious in here. And then we are going to use that jar lifter and just simply start, you can see right here, loading them in. And if your water is boiling really, really hot, you can always turn it off for a minute and then turn it back on, because we aren't going to start the processing time until all of this comes back to a boil again. All right, so now we're going to put the lid back on, and any second it's going to come back to a boil, and that is when we are going to start the timer on the clock. And for this recipe, we need to put it in there for 10 minutes once it comes to a boil. So I'm gonna wait one more minute before starting the timer. All right, we are boiling away. So I'm gonna set my timer for 10 minutes. And then once the timer goes off, I'm gonna turn the burner off. I'm gonna remove the lid, but I'm gonna keep the jars in there and let them just chill out for 5 minutes. That's part of the process, but it's also going to make it a little bit safer to take that product out, because you're not going to be dealing with all the steam in that boiling water. All right, so it was 10 minutes, and then I set the timer for 5 minutes. They've been sitting in there. We are ready to take them out. So it's really, really important when you take the jars out, because it's going to be very tempting to want to tilt them, because there's going to be water sitting on the top of them. But that is what you don't want to take this and tilt it this way. You just want to take them up straight off and just right on to your counter, any place that can accept something that's really, really hot. It's important that these jars cool for 12 to 24 hours before you move them, before you try to take the lids off, because it can take within that 12 to 24 hours for those seals to really properly form. You don't want to go through all this hard work and then have those seals not form a tight seal. And there you have it. All right, so since we have to let our jars cool for 12 to 24 hours before we're gonna shift or touch them, I made a batch ahead of time. So we have this same exact recipe, a low sugar jam, and first thing you want to do after those 12 to 24 hours after they've completely cooled is take those rings off. I know that sounds scary because you're thinking, isn't that what's holding the lid? But it's not. We have formed a nice vacuum seal, and you're going to want to take the rings off from each one of those and check to make sure that that seal has formed. Another pro tip, when you go to store these in your pantry or someplace where it's nice, dark, and cool, store them with the rings off, because otherwise you have the chance of this getting rusty. Of course, you'll want to save these for the future, for when you crack them open and then need to put them into your refrigerator. So in terms of how long these will last, usually for food quality, we say up to 1 year, especially if you're keeping them in a nice, dark, cool place. That way you're going to have that nice red color year round. Technically, in terms of food safety, it can last a lot longer than that, but you'll probably want to consume it within the year. And you'll want to use one of those nice fancy little can openers to open it. They do make reusable tops. But there you have it, folks, a low sugar strawberry jam. Think outside of the peanut butter and jelly box, or just jam on your toast. There are so many wonderful recipes that use jam. I hope you loved and enjoyed this jamming session. And of course, if you have any questions now or in the future on home food preservation, you can contact me at URI Cooperative Extension. Thanks so much.